The courtroom was heavy with silence when the sound of a slap shattered the air. A sound so cruel that it froze every heartbeat in the room. A black woman stood trembling, her cheek burning red from the force of a police officer's hand, but her eyes carried a fire no one could put out. The crowd gasped, expecting her to break, expecting her to shrink, but instead, she lifted her chin higher, her stare slicing through the arrogance of men who thought power was theirs to abuse. No one in that moment could have guessed what was about to unfold. No one could have predicted that the woman they tried to humiliate would turn the tables in the most shocking way. Within seconds, the same courtroom that had witnessed injustice would watch her walk toward the judge's chair, not as a victim, but as the power itself. She had come into the court not for herself but for justice, carrying the weight of years of silent battles against a system designed to keep her on her knees. She knew her skin color had always been used against her, but she refused to bend under the burden of discrimination. The officers thought a slap would silence her, thought humiliation would chain her spirit. But what they failed to see was that she was built on storms, stronger than their cruelty. As the spectators whispered in disbelief, the courtroom became a stage where centuries of oppression met a single act of defiance. The slap was not an ending, it was the beginning of something no one could control. What happened next would not only shake the walls of that courtroom, but also expose how power can shift when courage refuses to bow down to injustice. The officer's hands still hovered in the air as though he himself could not believe the audacity of what he had done. The woman's face stung, but her soul was unbroken. And with a calmness that terrified everyone watching, she stepped forward. Murmurs filled the courtroom, the crowd torn between fear and awe, yet no one moved to stop her. The judge sat frozen, his gavel trembling slightly in his hand, as if he too knew that something irreversible had been set in motion. Each step she took carried the weight of generations silenced, mocked, and beaten down, but in her every stride there was a promise of revenge. Not with rage, but with undeniable authority. The officers moved toward her, but one glance from her steady eyes made them hesitate, as if their own uniforms no longer gave them the shield of control they once believed in. She reached the bench, where the judge sat, and in a moment that felt suspended in time, she placed her hand on the polished wood. Gasps erupted as the judge rose slowly, almost instinctively, like a man surrendering to a force greater than law itself. The woman did not raise her voice, but her silence carried more weight than the loudest gavel strike. She lowered herself into the seat, her back straight, her gaze sharp. And in that single action, the balance of power shifted forever. The courtroom was no longer theirs, it was hers. The same place meant to strip her dignity had transformed into her throne, and everyone present felt the undeniable truth of it. The officer who slapped her tried to speak, his words tumbling out as excuses, but she cut through his lies with nothing more than her presence. People whispered that this moment was more than rebellion, it was justice unfolding in its purest form. The courtroom doors burst open as reporters rushed in, their cameras flashing, capturing history in the making. What had started as an act of violence against a black woman had turned into the exposure of a corrupt system. The world would now see not the weakness they tried to impose on her, but the strength they could never crush. With every passing second, the tension grew unbearable. The spectators who had once pitied her now rose in respect, their eyes locked on the woman who had dared to rewrite the script of power in a single act. She began to speak, her words steady and piercing, unraveling the lies, the corruption, and the injustices buried deep within the very walls of that court. Every sentence she spoke was a blade, cutting away at the arrogance of those who believed they were untouchable. The officers who had laughed before now lowered their heads, unable to meet her gaze, while the judge stood silently, his authority crumbling like dust in the air. She was not just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every voice silenced before her, every injustice ignored, and every soul humiliated by the very system that promised fairness but delivered chains. By the time she finished, the courtroom was transformed. No one looked at her as a victim anymore, they saw her as a leader, a symbol of power that rose from pain. What had begun with a slap had ended with a revolution brewing in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. The judge's chair was no longer just wood and leather, it had become a crown she wore with unshakable dignity. When she finally stood from the judge's seat, the courtroom did not return to silence, erupted with applause. The kind that carried more than sound, it carried change. The officer who had slapped her was escorted out, his arrogance crushed under the weight of shame, while the judge himself walked away, his authority stolen by his own failure to protect justice. She walked out of the courtroom not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as the embodiment of defiance, carrying the respect of those who had watched her transform humiliation into power. Her story spread far beyond those walls, becoming a beacon for the broken, a reminder that the system built to destroy her could not contain her strength. The slap meant to degrade her had instead awakened a force that no one could silence. In that moment, history had been rewritten, and she was its author.